Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another TMDSAS Office Hour. My name is Sulema, and I'm the Communication Specialist for TMDSAS. And I'm so excited for today's session. We're going to talk about gaining residency in Texas. And another reason why I'm excited about this is because we have a guest speaker. You might remember her from last year if you were with us last cycle, but Nicole is actually part of the original TMDSAS Office Hour cast crew member. And she is with us again to speak about gaining Texas residency for the application cycle. So I'll go ahead and let Nicole, who is the TMDSAS Service Delivery Coordinator, talk to us, walk us through a presentation that she has for us today to learn more about this topic. And then we'll have the Q&A questions at the end. So if you can go ahead and wait and post your questions till the end of the presentation, that way perhaps we might be able to answer some of your questions now. So I'll let Nicole take it over.
All right, well, thanks, Sulema. I am so excited to be here, to be back in the office hours of TMDSAS. So let's not waste any more time. We're going to talk about Texas residency, some of the things that go into establishing residency and what that process looks like when you apply. So let's get that going. All right, so just to double check, we see the Residency 101 PowerPoint. Great. So let's talk about what goes into Texas residency. So the basics of residency that we're going to talk about today include that notorious 90-10 law. What does that mean? Why does it matter? How a person can establish and maintain residency. What is the census date? What qualifies as a temporary absence? How does residency determination impact tuition? And how is residency determined through TMDSAS? So that 90-10 law here in Texas. So you might already know that per Texas law, 90% of the seats at public medical and dental schools must be reserved for Texas residents. So what does this mean? A couple things. It definitely creates an incentive to establish Texas residency prior to applying to medical or dental school. And it also requires that residency review be a really important part of TMDSAS application processing. We're going to talk more about what that actually looks like. So here's a how-to when it comes to establishing and maintaining domicile. The first way, which applies to many of our applicants at TMDSAS, just involves graduating from a Texas high school. It does also mean that they lived in Texas the 36 months prior to high school graduation and that they have maintained their residency by residing in Texas for the 12 months prior to the application deadline. So at its core, it's that Texas high school graduation, but there are a few things to keep in mind about that. For a person who didn't graduate from a Texas high school, they will then need to establish domicile some other way. This is key for persons whose primary purpose for moving to the state has been education. And so if that is the case, then they'll need to show that they have established residency some other way. And here's how they can do that. That's going to be done through gainful employment, property ownership, marriage to a Texas resident, or ownership and operation of a Texas business. Now, with these four methods, that also requires that this be done, that there be at least a 12-month record of this, if you will, by the application deadline. So let's take one example, gainful employment. We'll use the application deadline this year, November 1st, as the cutoff. So this means that a person will need to have been employed for 12 months by November 1st, meaning by November or starting in November of 2020, they'll need to have been gainfully employed, which means working an average of 20 hours or more every week for that 12-month period. So the same thing with these other means, other modes of establishing residency, a person will need to show that they have done that and maintained that for 12 months by the application deadline, which means they'll want to think back 1 year, 12 months prior to the deadline, to start this process if they haven't already. There's lots more information about this on our website and helpful links to other resources to help understand the rules around Texas residency and how TMDSAS kind of creates this process. So if you haven't already checked it out, highly recommend you go to TMDSAS.com. There is a link right on our homepage to get to residency, and then from there, it'll take you to other helpful places. But let's continue talking about a few more things. So this census date this term gets thrown around a lot. You'll see it in the rules regarding residency, which are part of the, which are established by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. It is the basis upon which TMDSAS develops their policies for reviewing and determining residency. So we're going to talk about what this means for TMDSAS and our applicants. So the census date simply refers to the deadline by which a person must be able to show that they will have met Texas residency requirements. For the purposes of TMDSAS, we use the application deadline. So for our current application cycle, entry year 2022, that deadline is November 1st. And we use this date as our census date for determining residency. So in the example I shared just a moment ago, for a person to have shown, again, gainful employment, a year's worth, we'll need to see November 1st of 2020 through November 1st of 2021. Now, someone might be hearing this or seeing this and wondering, what does it mean if I submit my application prior to November 1st? Because most of you will, right? So you look at that opening sentence, what it says is that a person must be able to show that they will have met Texas residency. So we won't delay processing your application until November 1st just because we need to see that, full year. What we will do is we'll look to see what you're able to provide, again, just using that example of gainful employment. If you were employed since November 1st of 2020 and you're able to show consistent employment records, for example, your pay stubs that show consistent employment of 20 hours a week or more for, let's say, until you submit this July or in August, and we're able to see that, and we, based on your activities, we'll see that you will continue in that employment, then that should be enough to help make that residency determination. So that's the way to look at those dates. Understand the key takeaway here is that the census date for TMDSAS is the application deadline. That doesn't mean, however, that we cannot make a residency determination prior to that date. All right. Another thing that comes up often, you'll see it on our website, you'll see it on the ECV website, is temporary absence. So a temporary absence sounds like what it is. For a Texas resident, this is a temporary absence from the state, usually for a period of 12 months or less, but it could be longer depending on the reason. So if you are absent from the state for educational purposes, that's likely to be longer than 12 months, and that is not anything to worry about. If you have already established Texas residency, let's say that you're an individual who graduated from a Texas high school, lived here the 36 months prior, but for the past year, you have been, let's say you've been in Utah completing your undergrad, that's a temporary absence. You're away for educational purposes, and so you are still maintaining your Texas residency. Now, if a person leaves the state for a period of 12 months or longer, and this is for employment, research opportunities, volunteering, etc., this is not necessarily anything to worry about yet. However, this is a time where documentation could be really helpful. and helping TMDSAS make residency determinations, because that documentation can support that this is a temporary absence. So if you are engaged in or planning to be engaged in any activities that exceed 12 months out of the state of Texas, you want to make sure that this is considered a temporary absence, that it doesn't put your residency in jeopardy. Work on getting documentation either from your employer or your supervisor that just supports that this is a temporary thing and that you intend to return to the state at a certain time. And that, like I said, it really helps when TMDSAS is working through your application and making those residency determinations. Okay, another thing that comes up is determining residency for admissions versus tuition purposes. So, residency for admissions, this is what TMDSAS does. We make these determinations and think back to that 90-10 law, right? So we are helping the schools to meet that requirement by making this determination through application processing. The schools, in turn, make residency determinations for tuition purposes. So what this means for each individual is that their residency will be assessed twice. The first time is upon submitting their primary TMDSAS application, and the second time is prior to matriculation. Again, the first time for admissions purposes and the second time for tuition purposes. So it's very possible that a person may be determined a non-Texas resident for admissions purposes. However, by the time they're ready to matriculate, the school might determine that they now meet the requirements for Texas residency for tuition. Don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty of that, but just understand that that is a process that happens twice when applying to professional school through TMDSAS. Okay, and what does residency review look like with TMDSAS? So here's what you can expect as you're working through the process. If you're in that initial phase of completing the application, understand that the computer system makes an initial determination simply based on your responses to that core residency questionnaire, that proof of residency section of the application. It is important to remember that this is the initial determination. It is not final. Sometimes people see that determination and they kind of get freaked out, and you have to understand that there's more to the process. So regardless of what that initial determination is, understand that the next step is that once you submit your application and it's being processed by TMDSAS, our staff conducts a thorough review of that core residency questionnaire and related areas of the application. We use tons of information that you provide in this application to help make an official determination. During this phase two, during processing, it's very possible that our staff will reach out to you with questions about your residency, maybe seeking clarification or seeking documentation to help verify your residency. This might be the result of this might be different than that initial determination. And just be ready when once you've submitted your application, just be ready and watchful of any messages that come through from TMDSAS to make sure that your information is being received by our staff and can help us make a determination in a timely manner. Then there's a third part to this that might not apply to everyone or even most people, but if an applicant is determined by TMDSAS as a non-resident, then they do have the right to appeal that decision. So they will initiate that process. There are instructions on how to do that, both in our handbook and on our website, and your applicant liaison can help guide you through that process. But essentially, you need to know that if you are appealing this decision, then supplemental documentation is required. So you will need to be able to justify and prove that you are indeed a Texas resident, and that's going to require more information than what was previously received. And please know that those appeals decisions are final. So once we get to that point, that's it. So that was brief. There's a lot that goes on with Texas residency. Just as a recap, again, yeah, there's a lot that goes into the process. So just be prepared to work with your liaison and with TMDSAS. Our goal is to help guide you through this and work with you in helping to determine your residency. If you are new to the process or you have other questions, just brush up on your knowledge by visiting TMDSAS.com. Like I said, we have a link to our residency resources straight from our homepage, and it can take you to the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and other very useful websites in learning more about Texas residency. And again, if you have already submitted or you are about to submit your application, especially if you think there's a question about your residency, be responsive to requests from TMDSAS for documents or information that is needed to process your application and avoid any delays. So thank you so much. I know that we're going to get into the next part of our office hours. If you have any follow-up questions, you can send us an email at info@tmdsas.com with the subject line residency help. And if you are currently working with your liaison to resolve your residency, go ahead and send them a message through the portal. They have now become your main point of contact, and their goal is to help you in resolving any residency questions or problems at this point. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it back over to you, Sulema.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for that useful information. I did want to point out that for anyone who is listening via the podcast or will be watching later on our Facebook, YouTube, or even our Inside Health Education newsroom, just know that you can check out the description of the presentation. Nicole is really great at making everything make sense, but if you do want to go back and just make sure you can take a look at that, you can. And then we're just going to briefly go over some of the top questions that we get about residency during this time. And these are all questions that we gathered from emails, messages, and phone calls as well. But again, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll just go over these questions and we'll stop if we see a question. So, Nicole, this is one of the questions that we get, and it's very relevant during this time because of COVID. So I work remotely and live in Texas, but my company is based outside of Texas. How will this affect my residency for the gainful employment?
That's a great question. And like you said, super relevant. The good news here is that working remotely for an out-of-state company while residing in Texas will not negatively impact your Texas residency. You'll want to be sure that you can provide documentation to support that you have resided in Texas, at least for 12 months by that census date, by the application deadline. So, for example, that could be evidenced in your Texas driver's license, in your pay stubs that will show your Texas address, and any other documentation, perhaps a lease, utility bills that show that you have resided in the state and you are simply working remotely for an out-of-state company.
Okay, thank you. And let's see. Another question is, I am trying to establish Texas residency through the high school graduation option, but how can I show that I lived in Texas during the 12 months prior if I was in school out of state?
Okay, great. So I think this is kind of one of the examples that we covered in the PowerPoint where the person has already established Texas residency of their own right by graduating from a Texas high school, and they are out of state for school. And TMDSAS will be able to see that in your application. So I talked about us looking at various parts of your application along with that core residency questionnaire to help make a determination. And this is an example of that. We will look at your activities. We'll look specifically at your chronology of activities. and we will see where you graduated high school and where you have been since. And if everything lines up, we see that you have been out of state just for educational purposes, then that should, in most cases, be the end of the matter. We may have a few questions for you, but this is one of those very direct, very simple cases, and nothing to worry about if you've been out of state for school.
Perfect. Okay, and then we have another question. It says, I'm planning to apply in 2023. Are you using October 1st or November 1st for the date to establish Texas residency?
That's a great question. And while I can't predict the future, it's very possible and very likely that we will be sticking with the November 1st deadline. That might, there might be a slight deviation of a couple of days, just depending on when the month begins, what day of the week that's on. So know that this could change. Because the change from October 1st to November 1st happened rather recently. And that was in response primarily to the pandemic and how we were adjusting for that and wanting to support our community. So know that those dates are not necessarily fixed forever. But from this point on, it's likely that November, beginning of November will be our deadline. And if there are any changes to that, our pre-health community will be notified well in advance of those changes.
Thank you, Nicole. It will be hard to predict the future, and we communicate this via phone as well. But by the looks of it, it looks like it's going to stay at around the November, beginning of November, just to allow more time for our applicants.
Yes.
And one of the ways that you can establish your Texas residency is through property. So we do get a few questions about property. One of the questions that we've gotten was, I own property with my father. Can I use this as a way to establish Texas residency?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it because it is common to have questions about property ownership. And so the rule regarding property ownership is that it must be sole or joint marital ownership. So this means either the applicant as an individual owns this property, or it is owned with a spouse. So it cannot be jointly owned with a parent and be used to establish Texas residency.
Okay. And another follow-up with that is for those who own property, but they're currently renting it out to someone. Is there any way that they can use that to establish Texas residency?
That's also a great question. So in addition to owning property, this individual must reside in that property. So we'll need to see the warranty deed that they own the property and that they have owned it or will have owned it for 12 months by the deadline. And we'll also ask for other documentation to support that they themselves reside there. So that is going to be utility bills, their Texas driver's license. This is something that's supported by Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board that does require that two-part process. It's not just owning, but it's also residing in that property as well for the 12 months prior to the deadline.
Okay. See, we do have a question from TXHES Facebook page. So what if you are determined as a Texas resident for an undergraduate Texas university? Is there any reason why TMDSAS would have another determination?
So that's a great question. And one distinction we need to make here is if this is a public or private institution. So if it is a public institution that determines or classifies you as a Texas resident, then typically that alone is enough basis for TMDSAS to also classify you as a resident. In saying that, if there are every case is unique. So if a person was previously determined by a public university here in Texas as a Texas resident, but then they left the state, and maybe they were engaged in work or other activities that exceeded 12 months, and they may have lost their residency, that could account for a different determination. But typically, if a public university classifies someone as a Texas resident, TMDSAS will honor that as long as the applicant is able to provide evidence of that.
Okay. And we do have quite a bit of questions coming from that page. Another one is, what if you graduate from a Texas high school, but during your out-of-state undergrad, your parents move out of state? Am I a resident or not?
That's a great question. So I will say we can't make any guarantees of anything before reviewing a completed and submitted application in its entirety. But let's just take this scenario. A person has already established Texas residency through high school graduation. They are completing their undergrad and are still dependents of their parents who then move out of state. This person still has maintained their own Texas residency, even though they are a dependent of potentially non-Texas residents, depending on how long the parents have lived out of state. So this is great news, I think, for a lot of folks who have graduated from a Texas high school and might be in this period of transition where their parents might have moved out of state. Just know that you have established it of your own right. And as long as everything else is consistent, let's say you've only been out of state for educational purposes, you have not exceeded 12 months by doing other activities that would cause you to lose your residency, maybe working or doing other things out of state post your undergraduate studies, then it is very likely that you'll be determined as a Texas resident.
Yeah, and that is good news because we get a lot of questions for a lot of people who are in this particular situation. And another one with gainful employment. I read something about having to make enough money to cover your undergrad tuition. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so it's kind of a combined way to look at gainful employment. So the first thing we do is we look to see, have you met the hour requirement? So that hour requirement, again, is 20 hours, an average of 20 hours per week for 12 months. If we aren't able, maybe because of the way your pay stubs are generated or something that doesn't allow us to see an hour count, we can then look to see if the amount that you earned during that time would cover 1/2 of your tuition and living expenses. So when we say living expenses, we're going to be looking at your rent. We're not going to, go beyond that. We'll look at your rent and we'll look at your tuition. And so we'll use that information coupled with what you've provided in terms of your earnings to help make a determination that way.
Okay. And then similar back to the property example, can your siblings own the property with you?
Also, great question. There have been a few scenarios in which this has been the case, and the answer, unfortunately, is no. So it's either sole ownership, you are the only person on that deed that owns that property, or you own it with your spouse.
Okay. And then similarly to that, going back to showing that you've been living in Texas, a lot of times we have applicants who reach out saying that they are living with significant others and who own their own house, and there's no way to necessarily have a lease to show that they've been living in the state of Texas for 12 months. What can they do in that case?
So that can be a little bit tricky, right? It might mean that the review process or determination process isn't quite as cut and dry, but what they can do to help show proof of residence is to provide a utility bill in their name. So if they're able to show that they have, let's say, they've taken on the electricity bill, something that is tied to that property, to that residence, then that would be a way to show that they have resided here in the state. And I would also encourage something that comes up quite frequently is a person will have moved to Texas, but they have delayed changing over their driver's license or voter registration. We look at everything that you provide us. We look at all of your activities and the way that you answer that core residency questionnaire. And we look to see, what does the documentation show us? And so if you have moved to the state and your intention is to make this your home, then the recommendation is don't delay in switching over those documents. So as soon as you move to the state, the earliest opportunity you have, change over that Texas driver's license, make sure you are registered in the state, and that can help support this, that you have resided in the state for those 12 months.
Okay, I'm glad that you touched on that because we do have another question that talks about the voter registration card. And this is for a current applicant who is in the cycle right now and was asked to upload this document. I don't have one. Is there anything else that I can submit? Any alternatives?
And that's it.
I just don't have it. I was asked to submit it, but I don't have it. Is there anything else?
Okay, that's a great question. That does come up, and I know that I've used voter registration card as a document to help support Texas residency. It's a very routine document that we request. My advice here would be to reach out to your liaison and look and see what you have already provided to see if that alone might be enough. Now, just to be honest with you, a voter registration card on its own is not going to be enough to prove Texas residency, but it definitely supports. So if you have submitted everything else and that might be the only outstanding document, look to see, check in with your liaison to see if what you have provided, is enough. And they will work with you to see if anything else might be needed. So I can understand that might be one that not everybody has or might not have, registered in time. So if that's your case, reach out to your liaison to see if any additional documentation is required. It's hard for me to say without looking at your specific situation what that could potentially be.
Yeah, and I just want to say that it is hard for us to make a determination, us as the TMDSAS support team, who is answering emails, questions via IMs, and especially in phone calls. We only know the same information that you were given by your liaison. So if you call and ask us this question, we actually don't have a way to let you know if there's an alternative. So our best advice would just be to reply to your applicant liaison in the internal messaging system in the application portal. They are going to be the ones who are very knowledgeable about residency more than we are, since we only know the basis. But they can better address this question and let you know if there's anything else that they need, or if they probably don't need it since it's a supporting document. And then just to go off from that, I did want to mention that, again, we get a lot of questions about people when they first submit their application, it's determined as a non-Texas resident. This is just the initial determination. It's not finalized. No need to worry about any documents that you need to upload just yet. That's only determined once your applicant liaison has reviewed your application. If they see that there's anything that they might need from you, they will reach out to you and let you know what those documents are at that point. So don't freak out just yet. It'll be okay. We are here to help you, especially your liaison. Once they review your application, they will be able to address those questions that you may have. And we do have another question that came in. Let's see. If your child is from out of state but becomes a resident during undergrad by property ownership, how should they answer the core residency question that says, what was your reason for becoming a resident? Education or establishing a home? If it is both, how do you answer the question on the core residency questions page?
That's a great question. So actually, the way to look at this is, you want to look at it through the lens of if you are attempting to claim Texas residency, then you'll want to answer in a way that provides TMDSAS with that basis for residency. So if at the point of application, this individual has already purchased a property and is likely to have met that residency requirement for this application cycle, then they'll want to respond accordingly to that question and indicate that their reason for being here is to establish a home. And they will then have the documentation to back that up.
Okay, thank you. These are all very good, great questions, you guys. So thank y'all. This is something that we need. Another one is, are there any rules as to how much money you need to make if you start a business?
That's also a great question. I would say that's one of those rare questions. Yeah, we don't get that a lot. So TMDSAS will be looking to see that based on the documentation you provide, typically these are the business filings, that this is an active business. We don't require any information on, how much money has been earned through this business, but we will want to see that it is a business that has been active and is not going to be I don't know my business terms, but it is not going to be closed, or I'm sure there's a better word for that, prior, within this time or within the last year. So we're looking to see that it has been active and filed with the state for 12 months by that deadline. And that you are the owner and operator of that business.
Nice. Thank you, Nicole. And then another component of establishing Texas residency is by being married to a Texas resident. So if I am married to a Texas resident, how can I gain Texas residency myself? How can I show that in the application?
Great question. So there will be, it goes back to kind of what I mentioned with the previous question, what your basis for residency is, and that can apply to you. That can apply to your spouse, and that can even, we'll just throw it in there because it is a relevant possibility. That can apply to your parents if you are a dependent. So we are looking to see on what basis that resident, that person, whether it's you yourself, your spouse, or your parents, have established Texas residency. So we'll continue talking about, spouses. So if your spouse has gained residency through employment, through property ownership, through business ownership, then they will provide documentation of their proof of residency. And then we will also look to see verification of your marriage. So that is your marriage license, and you will need to have been married for 12 months by the deadline. So we'll be looking at two things there. Does your spouse, in this case, are they able to prove that they themselves are a Texas resident? And are you able to prove that you have been married to them for 12 months by the deadline?
Gotcha. So for in that case, it's not, I have to have already been married a year prior to, in this case, November 1st of 2021. It can be November 1st of 2022.
That's correct. Yes. So as long as they're married for 12 months by the deadline,
okay,
then they are a Texas resident.
All right. So if anyone out there is planning on getting married, I suggest you do that quick for the next application cycle. All right. Well, that's, I don't think we have any other questions. Those are the ones that we had previously, just from the information that we had gathered already. And I don't see that we have any others coming in through TMDSAS or, I spoke too soon. So if the applicant's parents own a Texas-based business but don't live in Texas, does that help or is it irrelevant?
Perfect question. Something that we weren't able to get too deep into when going through the PowerPoint is that second key part of establishing and maintaining Texas residency. So that maintaining part of it is the residence, the physical residence in Texas. So in this situation, if parents own a Texas-based business, but they themselves do not reside in Texas, then they can't use that as a basis for their own Texas residency. And therefore, any dependent children would also not qualify as Texas residents under that situation.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And actually, the establishing and maintaining domicile was one of the questions, but you already answered it. And I think that's it. That's all we have for now. I guess we can just wait a little bit longer just to see if we receive any further questions. But these have all been great. I really appreciate everyone for engaging in this session with us. Nicole for answering these questions. These are really great questions. And I did want to say that if you happen to miss a part or know someone that can benefit from watching this session, you can always watch this. The recording will be on our YouTube channel, the Inside Health Education Newsroom, and you can always watch it on our Facebook pages. It will be posted on there as well.
That sounds great. Yes, these have been amazing questions. Were there any other kind of frequently asked questions that you receive that we haven't covered?
At the moment, it was mainly the property. Let's see. Current applicants typically ask about those alternatives to documents that they might not have. Again, that's just something that they would need to ask their liaison. Let's see. Another question that we've gotten, I don't know how well we can answer this one, but it's in regards to the 12 months with the November 1st date. So if someone doesn't have proof that they were here by November 1st, but perhaps their first pay stub at their job shows that they were paid on November 23rd, do you think that'll affect their establishing their 12 months? Is that really strict?
That's a good question. And but I will say here is because we don't want to deviate from these deadlines. These deadlines are in place. However, I will say if this is your specific situation, reach out to your applicant liaison. Make sure that you have provided all of the information that they have requested. And again, something to keep in mind that is part of what we do is, we look at everything holistically. We look at the documentation you provide, we look at your activities, and we look to see, is there a basis that supports that you intend to make Texas your home? And so while I can't say that, that particular situation, what the outcome will be, keep in mind that we are looking at everything as thoroughly and as fairly as we can to see if the whole composite here supports that you intend to be a Texas resident, then you likely have a good chance of being classified as one. But every case is unique, and so we have to work through them individually. So just please, if this is you, if you're watching, if you are currently working to have your residency resolved by TMDSAS, just be sure that you keep working with your applicant liaison, you provide documentation that they request. If you have questions for them, send those questions to them. The more clarity and transparency we have and greater understanding from everyone, the better and smoother this process runs.
Thank you, Nicole. That's reassuring. We did have another question come in. So the 12-month date needs to be by November 1st, not when the application is turned in, correct?
Yeah, so what I'm understanding this question to mean is that, let's say somebody purchased a property November 1st, 2020, which is shown on their deed. However, they are applying and submitting their application prior to November 1st, 2021. And so, yes, that will be fine. But remember, what we are looking to see is that a person will have established residency by that November 1st deadline, and that deed will show that there will be 12 months of property ownership by that time.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Sometimes we have applicants who think that it has to be by the time that they submit their application, but it's just reassuring that you say it's as long as it's by the deadline, it should be fine.
Yes.
I did want to point out earlier you mentioned something about looking at the whole application for determining residency, especially the chronology page that also helps you guys get a good indication of where they will be in the future by the time of the deadline. I did want to mention that there is a message that comes up for some applicants, and it says something about a 3 months gap. And it's a little warning that in red letters, hey, you have a 3-month gap here. Make sure you fill in your activities. Can you provide a little bit more clarity of what that may mean, and especially when it comes to residency?
Yeah, so the schools really are wanting to see consistent activities. Depending on the type of applicant you are, that might be from your activities starting in high school, you're a vet applicant, or that can mean upon high school graduation if you're a medical or dental applicant. So if we see, when it comes to making residency determinations, if we see a 3-month gap, that might create questions for us as to where this person was, what they had been doing during that time, if it could impact their residency. So the advice here, which would be for any applicant, regardless of whether or not Texas residency is questioned, is to make sure that they are thorough and consistent in those activities, and that every month is accounted for, and that they are speaking to where they were during that time.
Thank you, Nicole. That's helpful. Let me see. I think we have another one. I think it's the same question about the making sure that we have the 12 months deed in by November 1st deadline, and not when the application is turned in. So the answer to that would be, sorry, I think you're just better at addressing it than I am.
I think with that, kind of with the response there was, just to understand that we look to see 12 months by the application deadline. If that's met earlier on, great. But if, let's say, by the time you submit your application, you will not have completed the 12 months, that's okay, excuse me. We're not going to hold your application back and make you wait the remaining time. We will look at the date that the property was purchased. We'll also, like I said, we'll look at utility bills, and we'll look to see, okay, does everything indicate that this person will have met the requirement by the deadline? And in most cases, that's going to be yes.
Okay, perfect. It looks like it's already 12:50, so we're getting close to that hour mark for our office hour session. So it looks like we also don't have many questions coming in, but if you guys do have a question, you guys are more than welcome to contact us. Another way that you can do this is by one, messaging your liaison if you're a current applicant who is in that process of establishing or clarifying anything in regards to residency. Another thing would be to call. Just know that we will work with you, and if we don't have the answer to it, because not everyone at TMDSAS Support is fully knowledgeable like Nicole is about residency, but you can always email us as well to the info@tmdsas.com email address, and you can explain your situation there. What's really neat about that is we have a written record of what your situation looks like, so we can refer to it and be able to better help you out than via call just right then and there. It allows a better layout of what your situation looks like to better adjust and help guide you through that process. So yeah, I think that will be it for now. Again, if you missed out on this session, you can always rewatch it on our YouTube channel, the Inside Health Education Newsroom, the podcast, and we will definitely have this link in our TMDSAS website. You should be able to find that on that homepage where we have our feed down at the bottom with the Inside Health Education Newsroom. But I did want to say thank you, Nicole, for taking time out of your day, your busy schedule, to meet with us and go over this very important topic. Anything else that you would like to add?
Well, one, I want to thank you for inviting me. This was a lot of fun. I missed it. This is a great topic. I'm glad that we had the questions that we did. So I really appreciate you facilitating that process and making sure that all of these really important questions get answered. So thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Nicole. So I'll go ahead and say goodbye. Again, if you have any questions, you can always just contact us in the message via the application portal, email, and by phone. Thank you guys. You guys have a wonderful good rest of y'all's day.
Thanks. Bye.